What's the first challenge? Now, in case anyone's missing the point of that first slide, I think I ought to just take a minute or two to address the moving of the goalposts. What do I mean by that? Well, as some of you will know, in just the last couple of days, the FCA has announced a change to the deadline, an extension to the deadline for implementation through to March of 2021. In place of December. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking around this. Obviously, there's other issues that we had intended to talk about, but I thought firstly it would be remiss of me not to even mention it. What was interesting, and particularly those of you perhaps that have not seen that announcement, as I say, just in the last couple of days, that release has gone out from the FCA, was this statement. Senior managers must ensure that conduct rules training is effective so that staff are aware of the conduct rules and understand how to apply them. These programs will require training, will require planning, time and effort to deliver effectively. And that's something, of course, that we would absolutely agree with. It's one of the reasons why we're running these sessions. But interestingly, the FCA is promising some further communications about its expectations. What we can do over the course of this session, hopefully, is make sure you're familiar with what the FCA has currently been saying. Do just be aware, though, that as I've said, the FCA is indicating it will be giving out some more information. Some of us would like that information to be as available as soon as possible, but obviously we'll just have to wait and see when that appears. So that's our first point. Just do be aware, if you hadn't seen that news in the last couple of days, that the timeline has been extended for the implementation of SM&CR. This is for FCA solo regulated firms. Of course, if we have anyone on the call today who is from a bank or other dual regulated firm, you will know you are already subject fully to the regime and all of its elements. Okay. But more generally, what is the particular challenge perhaps around this? Well, before we go any further, what I want to do is give you the chance to give your perspective. So what you're going to have in just one moment is a question come up in front of you. It's going to be this question. How confident are you that your firm's conduct training is effective, or will be if it's not taken place yet, and that it meets all of the FCA's expectations? So hopefully you should now have that in front of you as a question. I'm going to give you a few moments to respond to that. We've already got 20 responses in. Let's just see how those numbers are planning out. I'm going to give you a last few seconds. 2/3 of you voting so far. Let's see if we can just push that number up a little bit. Okay, last few seconds for anyone who hasn't voted. Do make your selection. Okay, still a last few votes coming in. I'll give people a last couple of seconds. Okay, nearly everyone voting now. Let me show you how it looks. Okay, so how confident are you that your firm's planned conduct training meets the FCA's expectations? Really interesting results. Actually, a couple of sort of answers for 1 and 4. In other words, not at all confident, or we're not carried out any, we've not planned any. Most popular answer, about 2/3 of you, those saying reasonably confident, and about 1/3, just shy of 1/3 actually, very confident, which is interesting. And perhaps we're going to see some of the issues as we go forward over the remainder of the session. So let's go back to the slide deck. That was our starting point. And just to pick up a question, sorry, that is being asked. Yes, the intention of the FCA, and it is going out to consultation on this, the intention is that it will delay the implementation of the SM&CR for conduct staff. So it is that all of the remaining elements that essentially haven't come into force yet will be delayed, including the implementation of the conduct rules, or the application of the conduct rules. Okay. So the challenge. Just a brief word or two before we go into some specific pitfalls that I think are there for the unwary, things that we potentially want to avoid as we're conducting our conduct training. But firstly, I just want to remind you of a case. Many of you perhaps may be familiar with this, you may remember it. It's the case of Matthew Uberoy. Dates back to 2009. And it was insider dealing. He was prosecuted, he was found guilty of insider dealing. But what's the relevance of this for our topic? Well, he was a student, he was a graduate intern at a city firm, and was found to have committed insider dealing. But what has always struck me about this particular case is he talks about attending a compliance talk. It all went over my head, but the biscuits were very good. And for those of us who spend a great deal of our time communicating, training people in relation to compliance and regulation, it's always slightly perhaps depressing thought that actually in this particular case at least, the individual came away and his main recollection appears to have been the quality of the biscuits. He went on to say the training was so limited that he learned more from films like Wall Street. So here's the challenge as I see it. If our conduct training is going to be effective, firstly, we hopefully need to be able to get to the point where people remember our training more than they do the quality of the biscuits. Secondly, that we leave people in a position where they actually can apply the training, that they're not looking to Wall Street or maybe the more recent examples for guidance on actually how they behave in their role. But then thirdly, that we go beyond simply restating the rules for them. And that's one of the aspects that we're going to spend a bit of time unpacking over the rest of the time is really just how do we do that? How do we get past simply restating the rules? Because I just think if that's all that we have in mind when we think about conduct training, that's a very diminished view of what we're seeking to achieve. So for it to be properly effective, we want to go beyond that simple restatement of these are the rules of what you must or must not do. So this session then, we have talked about 4 pitfalls, 4 potential areas that, traps that maybe it's possible to fall into when we're conducting conduct training. And as I've said, based on the many sessions that I've delivered, I know each of these is a real potential trap to fall into. So we're going to outline each of these pitfalls and then think around what we can do perhaps to address them. And it's that first one actually relates to what we were just talking about, getting beyond the rules. Let us just step back and remind ourselves what the FCA's rules in relation to conduct training specifically say. So an SM&CR firm must ensure that or everyone relevant who's subject to the rules, firstly is notified of the rules, and secondly know or understand rather how the rules apply to them. Okay, so they must firstly know the rules and also understand how they apply. Part of that is going to include the provision of suitable training. And if you notice the second part of the last section there, what is suitable training going to ensure? Well, firstly, it will mean that people have an awareness, a broad understanding of all of the rules. But secondly, a deeper understanding of the practical application of the specific rules that are relevant to their work. Now, in other words, the FCA is very concerned that actually it's not simply about informing people, just stating the rules for them. They've actually got a good understanding of how they apply, particularly those that are especially relevant. And the FCA, and again, this is in the FCA handbook, again, just gives a couple of specific examples which are quite helpful. So if you have people who are trading in the financial markets, for example, Rule 5, which is the rule relating to market conduct, it clearly is going to apply, and the individual is going to need to know how that rule applies to them in their particular circumstances. So in relation to their particular trading activity. Similarly, and I assume most firms, if not all firms, will have some employees who deal directly with the customers. Well, again, very clearly from the FCA, those employees are going to need to have information about particularly Rule 4, which is about treating customers fairly. So the FCA just being very clear about its expectations that firms are going to be streaming training. In other words, we're going to have to be focusing particular aspects of training so that it is relevant and that it applies to people in particular types of role. Just in terms of some further guidance, and some of you will be very familiar with this, this was the FCA Stocktake report back in August of last year. So this was a review of how dual regulated firms like banks and others had implemented the new regime. And if you've not seen this, it's an interesting read. In particular, there was a reference to conduct rules and training. Firms have not always sufficiently tailored their conduct rules training to staff's job roles, was the finding. In other words, despite, and the reason I showed you very clearly the guidance in the FCA handbook was that their finding was many firms were failing almost at that first hurdle. Clearly had not absorbed that message, that actually it just wasn't being tailored to staff's roles. But the last point there as well, I think, is interesting. Many firms unable to explain what a conduct breach looked like. And I have to say, and again, some of you may have had experience of this yourself, but I can vividly remember a whole series of occasions when delivering training like this. We've got maybe towards the end of the session, we've gone through the rules, we've looked at various case studies and scenarios, and then I pose the final question: what would a conduct rule breach look like in the context of your role? In other words, in your team, in your business unit, what would a conduct rule breach look like? And I've just been, well, perhaps even staggered just to see how few people can very easily or clearly articulate what that would look like. And so that failure to maybe connect this training with, okay, when I'm sitting back at my desk in an hour's time and I'm out of the training session, what does this actually look like in my role? So the first of our pitfalls, the first of our traps, and one that clearly firms have fallen into, is that failure to go beyond the rules. Look at application. What does this actually look like? Pitfall number 2, pitching it right. And again, this is really around actually as we're planning and designing our training program, how do we ensure that we're pitching it at the right level? Let me give you a very simple illustration. Just imagine for a moment that you work in an investment firm, you're maybe an advisor or a portfolio manager. You've been told you've got to attend this conduct rules training, and there you're sitting there wishing you were somewhere else, maybe wishing you were back at your work, getting some things done. And the trainer puts this question in front of you. You're a portfolio manager at an investment firm. During a meeting with the CFO of a listed company, you unexpectedly hear some inside information. What should you do? So here are our 3 answers, or possible answers. Should you call your best client and tell them to buy the company's shares? Should you post the information on your team's WhatsApp group? Should you tell the trainer to stop using such simplistic scenarios? Yes, I appreciate an exaggerated example, but I hope you'd all agree with me, but actually C is, it seems to me, undoubtedly the best answer there, that actually if you are going to use scenarios, and we're going to talk in a moment about why that's almost certainly going to be required as part of effective training, we need to really think carefully about not using overly simplistic or very, very black and white scenarios or case studies. It's simply because, in my experience at least, if we're talking to often professional, highly qualified, very intelligent individuals, simply putting very simplistic scenarios or case studies in front of them just feels patronizing, and very often will just reduce any engagement that you would have hoped for. Again, just drawing on some FCA guidance, some of you will have seen this back in May of last year, the FCA in its feedback on the 5 conduct questions program. All of these documents available, by the way, on the FCA website. We're also able to give you a copy if you need any of these. A specific reference to training. And it makes a general comment about the use of face-to-face sessions and ethics training. And then it talks about the fact that one firm in particular that they had looked at has built up a library of around 50 grey issue scenarios. Now, whatever exactly was meant by this term, I think it's certainly the case that when we're talking about grey scenarios, we're talking about scenarios that have multiple either right or at very least arguable answers. And so actually introducing slightly more nuanced case studies and scenarios, slightly more sophisticated case studies can be really helpful. if you notice what it went on to say, not only did they use these case studies, but actually one firm in particular, while it was doing these training sessions, was taking notes to identify, okay, is there anything that comes out of this discussion that indicates we need to look again at our procedures, or we need to think again about additional training? A simple example, if people do find it a genuine dilemma in terms of how to respond to something, even though your firm's policy actually is very clear, well, does that mean then we need to revisit our policy? Does it mean we need to look again at how it's communicated and how we've trained people? So, trying to avoid very simplistic scenarios. Pitfall 3, controversy. Now, some of you may have had first-hand experience of this. I certainly have. Given the type of subject we're talking about, they can generate some quite heated, in some case, discussions and some responses from people. I've had one or two fairly colourful ones. This is the gist of one that I've heard, as I say, in particular, a slightly more colourful version of this one in terms of the language, but it's not my job to snoop on my colleagues. And this was in the context where we were talking about a colleague who had, and we became aware that the fact that the colleague had overstated their expenses claim. In other words, was over-claiming on expenses. And this individual, I can picture them actually, a senior fund manager at a particular firm, very, very agitated and saying, well, it's not my job. You make it sound like we live in a police state. It's not my job to snoop on my colleagues. That's not what I'm here for. So how do we deal with situations like that? Well, of course, on one level, this is all around how we interact in our relationship with the particular individuals. We may already know them, we may not. I think it is, though, fair to say we can certainly agree with any valid points that they make. Quite right, it's not your role to spy on colleagues. But again, allow for difference of opinion if there is genuinely a difference of opinion over some issues. And I've seen that in a number of instances where people can genuinely have a quite valid difference of opinion. But I do think absolutely challenging misconceptions and, if necessary, pushing back. Just taking you back to that particular example of the expenses claim. We had a little conversation around that, but one of the points I made was, so hold on, are we saying it is okay if you became aware of fraud? Is it okay not to escalate that? Is it okay not to report what is actual fraud? We were talking there about expenses. What if this was on a client account? Again, would it be okay? And so I think where there is some sort of misconception or misunderstanding, challenging that, but also pushing back. And part of that, because again, what we typically don't want to happen is for this just to become a personal issue between you and this other individual, is just to open up the discussion and actually more generally say, well, what's the view in the room? What do we think? Would it be okay? And so again, just thinking through, given the fact that some of the issues we raise, particularly if we're talking about any issues around whistleblowing or any of those related type concerns, then they may well generate some heat. They may well generate some fairly vocal responses. And we may just need to have thought in advance about how we might deal with some of those. Our last pitfall then, senior management involvement. When it helps and when it doesn't. This has been an interesting one for me as I've watched in a whole series of particular sessions, but I think I'd sum it up as this. Are we looking at buy-in or are we looking at dominance? Let's just briefly think, let me unpack that a little bit more. Let's think about what helps and what doesn't. It's undoubtedly the case. Clear communication of the value of training is really valuable and worthwhile. It's been very rare in my experience, but I have occasionally had senior managers introduce the session by saying something like, we know this isn't really relevant for you, but we've got to do it, so here's Nigel. As I've said, it is fortunately quite rare, but it has happened over the course of my career. So clearly though, if a senior manager can just communicate the value of this, that is very helpful. One way of doing that is with some introductory comments, either because they're physically in the room, or in some cases, obviously, they will use a town hall or a video recording or whatever, just to communicate the value and the importance of this. I know of one particular instance where there was a senior manager from within that business unit, very highly regarded within the business, who in the first few minutes of a session simply said, look, you know, in your career here, you're going to come across issues. You're going to experience some of these grey issues, some of these dilemmas. And that just validated that whole experience. It just helped to give some value to that. And so anything that is reinforcement of those key messages can be really helpful. What doesn't help? Dominating discussion. I've known instances where a senior manager is the first to answer, or at least the first to volunteer to answer. And if they do genuinely answer first, that can often be the last answer you'll hear. Maybe because people don't want to dissent or give an alternative view. And so that can be challenging, even more so, I think, in my experience. And I can actually picture a particular partner in a city firm who, in the middle of one of these sessions, we were looking at a particular instance, simply said, well, of course, you know, I can't imagine this ever happening at our firm. And whilst I believe, look, I'm sure that was quite sincerely held, of course, what it did was shut down discussion. In my experience, particularly when I've talked with more junior members of staff, the situation tends to be rather more nuanced than that. And so just simply shutting it down like that actually doesn't allow that issue to be aired and raised properly. It can even be as simple as seating. You know, obviously, depending on, you may or may not have any control over this, you may not know the senior manager concerned, but just even thinking around, okay, do you want them at the very front, or do you want them maybe at the back so you can call on them or they can contribute? Even just thinking around as something as simple as seating can make a difference in terms of their contribution. So here were the 4 pitfalls, the 4 traps that I've experienced that I think you need to think about as you're planning your conduct training: getting beyond the rules into application, avoiding simple scenarios, thinking about how you can introduce dilemmas, grey issues, diffusing controversy, and then lastly, senior management involvement. However, I rather suspect we have got close to 100 people on the call today, and I suspect at least some of you have got 1 or 2 in mind, either things that you've experienced or 1 or 2 things that you're nervous about or worried about. We've got just a moment or 2. I just want to pause using the chat. I know some of you have already contributed using the chat box, but if you've got a particular thing that's worrying you or anything you've experienced, I just want to pause for a moment just to see if there is anything that any of you want to suggest or just relay to us, any observations you have. Just give you 1 moment, just in case anyone's furiously typing away. Okay. And if any do come through, we'll see if we can tackle those. I've already made the point. If you've got a particular question you want to ask me about any of these things, you're very welcome to do that at the end of the session. I will hold on in case anyone does have any final questions to ask. Just before we close, NED training. Great question. Yeah, I think one of the interesting things, NEDs, in other words, non-executive training, my colleague Peter, who has huge experience in this area, is doing the next in our series of briefings. So I would absolutely say to all of you, but particularly to the person who's just asked that question, that's a great session. I think the one point I would make is there are indications from the regulators that non-executives have not been trained as much, perhaps as would be expected or is ideal. So again, ensuring that that is built in. What I found, at least in my experience, is of course, NEDs vary enormously. I have NEDs that I see in some of these sessions who have already had it 3 times because they're on the boards of 3 other firms, and others who come from a completely different sector, and this can be almost entirely new to. And so I think walking that tightrope can be quite challenging. Okay. So you'll recognize our final question. Just before we close, I've gone through, and I appreciate it has been quite quick, just given our time constraint, but we've talked a little bit more about expectations as well as the potential pitfalls. I'm just going to give you one more opportunity to respond to this question. You should have that in front of you. Based on your plans, based on everything you've seen and heard and what we've said this afternoon, What are you feeling? How confident are you that the training you're carrying out or the training you're planning to carry out will be effective? I'm going to give you a few seconds. We've had about 2/3 of you voting straight away. I'm not necessarily expecting anyone's answers changed, by the way. It just will be interesting to see. I'm going to give you a few last seconds. We've had over 70 votes in. Give you the last few seconds, anyone who hasn't clicked submit. Okay, looks like that's about everyone. Let me show you our results. Pretty similar to where we were first time round, but just interesting to see reasonable confidence from very close to 2/3 of you that your training is or will be effective. 28% of you happy to say you're very confident. With that in mind, I hope, and I know the time is very nearly gone, I do really hope that the session, brief as it's been, has been helpful, has been worthwhile for you. As I've already mentioned, we have another session coming out with my colleague Peter Haynes, which is looking specifically at board training and conduct. And so that, if you having any dealings with the board, that's a really valuable session. It's going to be very worthwhile, I think, to draw on Peter's very extensive experience. Unless there's any final questions, we are going to close the session there. I do hope very much, though, that it's been useful. If there is anything, as always, if there is anything to do that we can do to help, please get in touch. We would love to hear from you, either with me or with the team at CCL. Please do go ahead and do that. But other than that, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day. As I've said, I'll hold on. So if you're wanting to ask a question, you're very welcome to do that. But otherwise, that's the end of the session. So thank you very much.